their own governance. They can choose their own parameters, and then they will propose it via AIP to the AAVE DAO to see if the DAO accepts it. And then once the market is bootstrapped after a few months, there can be a vote to also protect the market by the security, the safety module. Sorry. So actually, I just mentioned now the safety module, but I haven't mentioned it earlier, and I think this is actually lacking in the presentation. So because the safety module is quite unique to AAVE, and so that's one of the cool things you can do with your AAVE tokens. Besides voting and using it as collateral on AAVE, you can stake your AAVE in the safety module. And the safety module is kind of a risk mitigation tool. It's like a safety pool for the AAVE protocol. At the moment, there's about $1.6 billion that have been staked in it. And so when you stake your AAVE, you generate passive income with it. At the moment, it's about 6.5%. But this is a compensation for risk, because when you're staking, you accept that if there's a deficit on the AAVE protocol, up to 30% of your stakes can be used to recapitalize it. So it's kind of a positive feedback loop where the AAVE DAO, participants can choose to, really commit their capital and risk their capital to make the AAVE protocol stronger and more resilient. And so in exchange, they're rewarded by some AAVE tokens. So, so as I was saying, I think one of AAVE's real strength is a high focus on security and risk management. So in terms of the smart contract security, AAVE is one of the protocols that's been the most audited. So there's been 6 audits on AAVE v2. In addition to, so these audits, they're kind of code review. So the auditors kind of review the code in detail and like run some tests to make sure that it's resistant to exploits. Then there's also been a formal verification by Certora. Formal verification is basically a theoretical check of the mathematics of the algorithm of AAVE. And actually very often, Certora, which is kind of the one big expert in formal verification, it's usually one of the last audits, and they can still find some stuff that the auditors, the previous auditors, like formal verification, can really find some potential exploits that were missed by traditional audits. And then Gauntlet, which is it's kind of an entity made of like quants who worked in trading floors and big banks before. And so they did a market risk assessment. And so basically this will talk to all the bankers in the call, because they're doing, they've basically created kind of an AI virtual environment of the Ethereum ecosystem with different agents which have pre-programmed behaviors based on what they've observed on the market. And so then they're simulating AAVE, they've forked the AAVE code directly, they've forked the Ethereum virtual machine, and they're simulating with Monte Carlo, like the range of possibilities and the volatility of the assets on AAVE. And so they found that actually AAVE was really resilient to extreme market conditions. They've also accounted for network congestion, and they've accounted for the safety module. And so overall, they found that there were very, the risks were quite small. So, so the AAVE risk framework is also one of the key holders of the protocol, and so one of the aspects I spent a lot of time on is the asset risk framework, because all the assets that are listed on AAVE add some risk for the AAVE protocol. And so assets listed as a borrowing currency are less risky because they're used for borrowing, and they can still, if they're exploited, if their price is exploited, it can still be problematic for the protocol. But like most likely what would happen is just it would create, if the price was manipulated up, for example, it could create some fake liquidations, but that's it. But assets that are collaterals, those are really, really high risk for the protocol because they guarantee the solvency of the protocol. And so if just one of these assets goes down, it can create a real systemic risk that impacts the entire liquidity pool. So in general, you can see here on the top of the table, these are the stable coins. And so these are typically mostly used for borrowing. And at the bottom of the table, these are the volatile assets. And so these are more typically used as collateral. And so basically in the risk framework, I created a methodology, an actuarial scoring methodology based on 3 key risk factors: the smart contract risk, the counterparty risk, and the market risk, to kind of assess the risks of each tokens. So this is kind of a simplified framework because I really try to use easy metrics to kind of extrapolate the underlying risk, but it's not possible to do a purely quantitative risk analysis. So there's also some qualitative analysis that comes on top based on, for example, for the smart contract risk, as proxies, I use the number of transactions and how long the smart contract has been on chain. So this is kind of giving you some views on how battle tested a contract is. But then it's also really important to check all the audits, to check the code and things like that. For counterparty risk, so we look at the centralization. So for this, we look at the number of holders. And for trust, we also look at the level of permission of the token. So for example, the most risky of all tokens that could be listed would be a token where there is a multi-sig that controls the token, that has among like the worst case scenario is a multi-sig that controls minting of the token. So this is kind of a very aggressive attack vector where, if a token listing has this, which is called infinite minting, then an exploiter could mint an infinite quantity of tokens, deposit them on the protocol, and borrow liquidity in exchange and empty the liquidity pool thanks to this collateral that in fact has no value and has been exploited. And so market risks are really important as well because, you want a collateral, you want a guarantee to hold its value, for example. So volatility is important, but you also need liquidity because if there's a price crash, there needs to be enough market liquidity to liquidate the asset. So these are all some important metrics. And so here overall, you can see that the global risks are pretty good. The overall risks of each asset, they're all mostly B or more. It's not always been the case. Like a lot of these assets have now been listed for a year or more. And so the overall risks have improved and they've been really well battle tested. So based on those risks, and mostly based on the market risks, you can assess the best risk parameters for integration on the AAVE protocol. So I'm seeing some questions, sorry. So yeah, so D+, WBTC has D+ on centralization because WBTC is centralized. So there is a bridge, and so there are a few entities that control the bridge between Bitcoin and WBTC. It's also doesn't have that many holders. Do you weight the risk equally? Yeah, so in the final rating, like basically I do I do the average, and then I round up for diversification. So yeah, so all the risks are weighted equally. This is just kind of, you know, this is the risk framework. I've actually received very little feedback on this risk framework. So, you know, I'm really hoping that moving forward, the AAVE DAO kind of takes ownership of this risk framework and improves it. You know, the AAVE DAO is actually forming a risk DAO. It's been proposed on the governance forum. And so the idea is basically to have 5 to 10 risk experts that are, you know, that not only have my level of expertise like actuary, but there'll be also like a smart contract expert, an Oracle expert, or legal expert. This is one of the risks here that we don't really take into account, but actually legal risk is also important. And so to kind of continue growing this risk framework and improving it. Yeah, so correlations is also something, yeah, something I look at, or would be good to look at that further. Yeah, so for this, so back on the risk parameters here. So yeah, so typically, so to parameterize these, I look a lot at the volatility of the assets for the liquidation threshold, also volatility, and also market liquidity, and same thing for the liquidation bonus. And then the reserve factor depends on the overall risks, because it feels like, you know, it feels fair that the protocol gets something that's proportional to the risk it's taking by listing this asset. So liquidity risk is also key. So one of the things I look at and I monitor is kind of how often is utilization over different thresholds, liquidation of a specific pool. And so high utilization, oh no, it's done it again. Yeah, so high utilization is really problematic, in particular for assets that are really used as collateral, because basically, like that's one of the, I don't know how familiar you are with liquidity protocols, and some people say that it's not the most financially efficient, but actually it's quite efficient, because what you're doing when you supply an asset, automatically that asset is available for borrowing. So you're generating a passive income on your supplied assets. But then when you're borrowing, you're using these assets again, which you're earning on, as guarantee to borrow and then do whatever you want. So, you know, there is kind of, your asset is used in two ways. But the downside is that if all the assets of a liquidity pool are borrowed out, well, then there is no assets that stay in the pool in case of liquidations. And so if the price crashes, well, the position wouldn't be able to be liquidated. And so the solvency would be affected. So that's why you'll see, like in the next slide, we use the interest rate model to mitigate this risk. And so the interest rate models of assets that are mostly used as collateral, which are at the bottom of the table, the slope 2 is mostly around 300%. So that means that the borrow rate at 100% utilization is like 310% or something. So you know, borrowers, like there are very few people that are willing to pay that much to borrow. And so the idea is, yeah, to get people to repay their loan and to get more depositors in. And so basically the interest rate model of are all organized around the optimal utilization. Before the optimal utilization, the rates are